Allow me to make a candid confession about teaching and about belief and about scholarship and about the book of Isaiah. The confession being, whenever I teach the book of Isaiah, I dread it for a particular reason. The reason is not because I don't love the book of Isaiah. I love it a lot. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible. It's tremendously important. I love the language, I love the themes, I love the imagery, just the whole thing. I dread it because there's one aspect of trying to teach it in an academic sense that to students of various kinds I have found, there's an aspect of it that just goes down like a rat sandwich every single time. And it's an issue where I just don't feel the same way as my students tend to feel. It's about this issue of prediction in Isaiah, the issue of prediction. And part of my confession is that I have a different way of viewing this, not a unique way in the history of interpretation and not different from every other human on earth, and certainly not different from many Christian scholars who are in my position, but different from the way a lot of typical or normal Bible readers, Christian Bible readers, let's say, read it. I don't think that they're wrong and I'm right, but obviously I read it and I think the way I do for a reason, so I embrace my way, but I'm not here to attack. I guess I just want to explain what I see as the problem of prediction in the book of Isaiah, a problem that actually has two different but related aspects to it. And I want to explain why I find this great spiritual meaning in prediction to be, it's just lacking for me, spiritually and intellectually. I try to integrate those two things, not always easy. And I want to suggest what I think is a better way on each of these two prediction fronts to view the book, better than prediction. Let me explain first what I mean by prediction. I guess when I say prediction, I'm referring to something like a Nostradamus style, crystal ball style. Here is a thing that's going to happen far in the future. I say it now. You have to wonder for dozens or hundreds or thousands of years whether the thing will come true. You kind of walk around with the scrolls under your arms, wondering, not understanding, thinking, hoping, yearning. And then when the thing happens, you're like, the prophecies, and then you get inspired that the prediction came true. I guess that's what I mean by prediction. What do I mean by saying that I think that the book of Isaiah provokes this problem of prediction on two different fronts? Here's what I mean. Front number one, problem number one, the problem of prediction within the book of Isaiah itself. So it is well known to readers of the book of Isaiah, if you've never just read all 66 chapters, just sit down on a rainy day, just like today out by my house in Oregon, and just read all 66 chapters of Isaiah. You should treat yourself to that experience. But at any rate, if you read it, you'll become very aware that the book has sections to it that address what seem to be very different historical and social scenarios. In briefest summary, and you can read about this, I'll put some links in down below that you can check out. These sections would be something like chapters 1 through 39, which address the activities and prophecies speaking. By the word prophecy, by the way, I should clarify right here, right in the middle of this sentence. By the word prophecy, I do not mean prediction. The words prophecy and prediction are not, to me, synonymous terms. So, prophecies, by that I mean oracles, speech, poems, songs, maybe some predictions, maybe some other things. Okay, so chapters 1 through 39, you have the prophecies of an individual, Isaiah of Jerusalem, Isaiah son of Amos. And at various points here, you see a little superscript, like in chapter 1 and chapter 2. I think there's one in chapter 13, or just various places you can find these where it's almost like as a paratext outside of the poetry or the narration, someone says, and this is the vision that Isaiah saw, right? Reminding us this is Isaiah of Jerusalem. And this occurs, and it really culminates in some ways in chapters 36 through 39 of the book, which are a prose section. It goes from being like first person, Isaiah speaking, thus says the Lord, to being like a third person prose story about this guy, Isaiah. And that section actually has a sort of conclusion to it, in which Isaiah kind of coaches Hezekiah through the crisis with the Assyrians. And the Assyrians are the big threat here. The Assyrians were the big world power on the scene during the 8th century, particularly the second half of the 8th century. They destroyed what the Bible calls Israel in the northern part of the country, up in Samaria around the year 721, 720 BC. And they threatened to destroy Judah around the year 700 or just before it, but they don't. And thus they are allowed to live in their place a little bit longer with their temple. But that's the first 39 chapters. Then you turn the page, turn the chapter, turn whatever to chapter 40, and you now have a different context. The language even changes just a little bit. I've been reading Isaiah slowly in Hebrew for the last several months. Slow going, it's hard poetry. But the language really does change, the vocabulary change, the themes kind of change in chapter 40 as well. And it becomes very, very clear to you as a reader that the speaking voice is now addressing people who are not living in the 700s BC. The named character of Isaiah and the superscripts with Isaiah's name stop appearing completely. He's not mentioned even one time in this second half of the book. And now the speaking voice or voices there seem to be addressing people who are living in Babylon during the exile. Yes, in the year 586 BCE, the next empire on the scene, who deposes the Assyrians around the year 613 BCE, the Babylonians, they come in, they destroy the temple, ruin the monarchy, deport a portion of the population to Babylon, and this speaking voice is very clearly speaking to these people. The speaking voice says things like, "Oh, my people in Babylon, leave Babylon, come back to the land." And there's really, the theme is encouragement to this group of exiles to return from their captivity, come back, and maybe to rebuild some kind of home there. And even, you might even notice in the last few chapters of the book, maybe chapters 56 through 66, you even notice that there's a changed context there too, which is to say that the author there seems now to be referring to a temple. Chapter 66 has this bizarre set of verses about maybe like rebuilding the temple, but maybe unhappiness with rebuilding the temple. I presume it's the rebuilt temple, just given the kind of historical narrative or journey that the book takes us on. That temple was rebuilt in the year 515 BCE under the Persian king Cyrus. And you can read about that in the book of Ezra, for example. And yeah, so maybe you even have a third context there at the end. So what's the problem of prediction, which is provoked here, right? The problem of prediction, which is provoked, a lot of P words, is that are you as a reader supposed to believe that the 8th century Isaiah of Jerusalem kind of was like writing these last 26 chapters of the book almost like in a trance state, or speaking them to people if you imagine them being spoken orally first. And like people were just like, what's this guy talking about? Captivity in Babylon? We're not even there, right? In fact, the prose section at the end of chapter 39 kind of exacerbates this tension a little bit by seeming to make a kind of prose prediction about captivity in Babylon that bridges you over to chapter 40 and then that context. So what's my confession then? What's so bad about this? Well, nothing's bad about it, okay. The kind of contemporary, or I should say modern scholarship of the book of Isaiah was really kicked off in the year 1892 by a German scholar named Bernard Duhm, D-U-H-M, who in his commentary on Isaiah at that time famously posited that the book of Isaiah really should be thought of as 3 books or 3 different parts. First Isaiah, which is chapters 1 through 39, that's the product of the 8th century. But then a second Isaiah, or Deutero-Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55, which really addresses the Babylonian period in the 550s, 540s, something like that, 530s maybe even. And then a Trito, or third Isaiah, the last 10 chapters of the book, which maybe even addresses a context after that. Scholars have received this and modified it, critiqued it, changed it, adapted it, adopted it in various ways for sure. Many scholars really like the idea more of something that in German would be called Fortschreibung, the idea of continuous writing, the idea that there's a tradition here which maybe begins with Isaiah of Jerusalem in the 8th century for sure, but then people kind of tinker with it, they write on it. So it's not necessarily that it's these 3 really distinct blocks, but just kind of a continuous tradition through time. And I guess as a scholar, trying to be a scholar, I really like this idea of the multiple authorship much more than the prediction scheme. Why? I think the benefits you get from it are just more clear as a reader. To me, the theological power of the book is stronger when we go back and we think, okay, how does authorship actually work in the ancient world? Is it an act of singular genius? Just I sit down, I write a book in the ancient world? No, this defies everything we know about authorship from the Iron Age, from even this time period, which really suggests communities processing things orally, speaking and orally, hearing, and passing on traditions that are then worked with by disciples, by others through time. I think this model just makes better sense of the historical, just like what you see on the page in the book. This is like a spiritual confession, right? This isn't like something I'm arguing academically, but my spiritual confession is that I just don't find a lot of like theological resonance or power in this idea that you have Isaiah of Jerusalem saying things that nobody would have understood, and then people carrying the scrolls around for like 200 years, maximally, by the time you get to the end of the book, sort of waiting for predictions to be fulfilled. It almost feels to me like a trick. Like the book is written in a way as to look that it is written by different communities at different times, mentioning, for example, as it does in chapter 45, for example, maybe chapter 43, Cyrus, the Persian king, by name. People in like the year 730 would be like reading this like, Cyrus? Who's Cyrus? Or are we supposed to think that Isaiah of Jerusalem just like wrote these things in secret so that it would be like a great faith trick that people would then see it and like believe in God or something like that? I just find that not inspiring, and I find it not historically meaningful as a way to read the book. Particularly as a Christian, I'm speaking here, okay? I find it much more spiritually meaningful and powerful to think of this community tracking with the Isaiah tradition. Is Isaiah a real person? Isaiah of Jerusalem, in my historical analysis, absolutely he's a real person. It would be absolutely insane to say that somebody invented the character of Isaiah hundreds of years after the 8th century BC. Just absolutely not. The book just doesn't even make sense without the founding figure of Isaiah at the fountainhead of this, right? There are no disciples and there is no tradition if there's not this singular figure of Isaiah who inspires this, okay? And might he have made predictions or inspired his group in particular ways in a future-oriented way? Absolutely. I'm not denying any of that. And if, who knows, it turns out that the prediction thing really is true and we can figure that out conclusively, I'm all for it. I'm in, right? I'm just looking at the book as it is and I'm thinking like, okay, when I get to chapter 40, when I get to chapter 43 and 45 and these references to Cyrus, this makes a lot of sense that a prophetic community, probably even one that's living with the people in Babylon, is engaging with them prophetically at that time and in that place. And I think that makes a lot of sense spiritually and socially to think of that witness being there and speaking in that way and adding to the tradition. And is there a point, somewhere where when the book is finalized in its current form that it's in? Yes, of course. Obviously, we have the book now as a single book. And that single book, just being a single book with, the superscript in chapter 1, verse 1, these are the words of Isaiah, son of Amos in Jerusalem and da-da-da-da. It kind of gives like to a modern reader, I think, an impression that everything in the book would then be by this singular author in this very romantic, predictive sense. Maybe if nothing else, I just want us to recognize that that's a particularly modern view of the author and that historically, when we look at the book, we just see different language, we see clearly different sections, and we see different social contexts here. I think an historical view of the book makes better sense of that and makes better theological sense of that. And much more could be said about how to make that theological sense. But I think that the pros and cons, right? The cons to my approach are you lose this like sense of prediction and wonder and awe at the idea of that, which I guess I've already confessed that I realize that many Christians feel that really intensely, and I'm saying that I don't. And I don't think it makes sense of the book historically. Okay, that's one. But I also said that there was another predictive problem in the book. Yes, it's the problem of the way that the book of Isaiah is received in the New Testament. I refer here maybe to the most famous reference, one of the most famous prediction and fulfillment references in all of the Bible. This would come in Matthew, chapter 1, the birth of Jesus the Messiah, chapter 1, verse 22. All this took place, the virgin conceiving the child, bearing the son. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Beautiful. Love the Christmas story, love this verse, love Matthew's adaptation of it. But here's a question. What does he mean when he says this was written so that it might be fulfilled? Is he talking about what we mean, the Nostradamus style, crystal ball style prediction? I actually think not. No, I think that's not the way to read this. I think a better way to read it is that what Matthew is doing is he is participating in a style of interpretation which is extremely powerful theologically, very popular in early Judaism, and engaged in multiple times by New Testament authors. And that style is typology, or figural interpretation. This isn't my own private reading of this. I find support in a book like this, Richard Hayes, Reading Backward, Figural Christology and the Fourfold Gospel Witnesses. Simply put, typology is a type of interpretation that runs along a horizontal axis that says, yes, these things in the past happened. They happened then and they were what they were. But now we can see things that are happening now, and we almost interpret, instead of prediction, which goes this way, predicting into the future, figural interpretation or typology actually interprets backward, so that this can actually go both ways. So the backward interpretation looks back from the birth of the baby and looks to another situation of crisis in Isaiah chapter 7 at the birth of a baby, connects these two moments spiritually and sees an even greater level of meaning than historically could have been seen or known in the year 735 or whenever Isaiah 7 was written. I think that this is a better way of thinking about the fulfillment idea. And in fact, I think it's a better way of thinking about Isaiah chapter 7, because if you only go with a mere prediction scheme, if you're only doing that thing I was describing, that like thing where the prophet is just like almost in a trance state and he's just saying things, in this case, things that wouldn't happen for another, like almost 800 years, you're left in a really awkward situation when you read this powerful chapter. Chapter 7, in the days of Ahaz, son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, and there's this war going on, right? Isaiah comes on the scene and asks King Ahaz, give me a sign. This problem that you're facing, this war, it's going to pass. And Ahaz says, I will not ask for a sign. I will not. He's very holy. I won't do it. I won't do it. Isaiah says, are you kidding me? I'll give you a sign. And he does. This is the famous verse in 7:14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the Alma in Hebrew, Alma, which means young woman of a marriageable age, but not yet married, probably. The Alma is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel, right? This is what Matthew famously translates from a Greek manuscript of the Old Testament as virgin, which would be the Hebrew word betulah. In Greek, this is parthenos. This is a famous issue in the history of interpretation, right? Did Matthew misunderstand then the Hebrew or the sense of this and thought it was a virgin, but really was never supposed to be a virgin? Well, there's a recent commentary by Hugh Williamson. I'll link it down below. Really great. I think he explains this issue really well. You should give it a read. I can't explain it here for time, but first of all, there might be semantic linguistic overlap between words like Alma and Parthenos, to the extent that it maybe means there's enough overlap that, we don't even have to say that those words are so different as they might seem. Okay, so there's that. But I think there's something else going on here too, where really what we see here in Isaiah 7 is, if this is a prediction or a prophecy in this moment in Isaiah 7, it's one that actually has a timestamp on it, and that timestamp is not 750 years. It's like 2 or 3 years, and he says it directly in the book. You just have to keep reading past the Christmas verse. He says, after it calls his name Emmanuel, he shall eat curds and honey, he, the child, by the time he knows how to refuse evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose 2 kings you are in dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and your ancestors' house such days as have not come since that day Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. Even worse. So first of all, to notice here in Isaiah 7, the context is not just like pure hope in some beautiful prophecy to be fulfilled. The context, as Hugh Williamson points out in his commentary correctly, I think, is actually judgment. It's judgment on Ahaz, not just salvation. He's saying, oh, this little problem you're worried about, don't worry. It'll be done in like 2 or 3 years by the time this kid grows up enough to eat some solid food. And it passes. In other words, the prophecy here of the child, whether he's referring to the king's wife, the prophet's own wife, some woman standing nearby in the court, or whether it's a collective interpretation of any woman who might be pregnant at this time, that prediction has a timestamp, and it's 2 or 3 years, and once it's done, don't worry, Isaiah says to Ahaz, don't worry about these little kings who are threatening you. Worry about the big king, Assyria. That's the real problem, right? So historically, I mean, as a pure prediction, like Isaiah just said this in the court of Ahaz, and everyone was like, a child will be born? A virgin will conceive? Who is he talking about? I don't know, let's write it down and then let's carry the scroll for 750 years. No, that's not how this is functioning at all. I'm just reading the passage literally as it appears on the page. It's not how this works, right? You have to get in the mindset here when you get in the mindset of typology, when you do theological interpretation of scriptures, when you interpret this in a Christian theological sense, you have to see multiple levels of meaning, not just that texts are locked into the literal historical circumstance of their first utterance. So that text, you have to, this requires not just like naive belief. I know for non-Christians, just like, oh geez, Christians, just believing in Santa Claus and whatnot. Okay, no, actually, we're talking about something very deep here. We're talking about something deeply imaginative. We're talking about something deeply philosophical and theological. We're talking about depth on a lot of levels here of what it would take to see the birth of the child in the book of Matthew in some kind of prophetic communication with this text. So I'd prefer to speak about this in figural or in typological terms as prophetic communication, as an interpretive act, not as a prediction, because the prediction thing just doesn't make sense of the text in Isaiah. And it has to work. You can't just be like, no, the book of Isaiah doesn't say what it says. And I just believe this is a pure prediction with no meaning in Isaiah's time, because he's telling us that it has a meaning. It really does. It's just that it has 2 meanings, or 5 meanings, or 50 meanings, or infinite meanings, okay? So this is a good book for thinking like that. And I think he shows how the gospel authors are doing something much deeper in that predictive scheme, much deeper than prediction. They're doing typology. And you see it all over the New Testament. I mean, like Romans 5:2, I think, there's a typology. Jesus is the new Adam, right? It moves horizontally through time. It's not that Adam never existed or Jesus never existed, or Adam only existed to be a prediction of Jesus or something like that. In that author's mind, it's that there's a comparison to be made between these characters for the purpose of an argument, for the purpose of interpretation, okay? I find that typology to be so beautiful. And in fact, Isaiah himself, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 43 and elsewhere, he himself engages in typological thinking, to talk about the Exodus. He envisions for his people in Babylon a new Exodus, where they will flee Babylon and they will go back into the desert, back into the wilderness, as it were, and water will gush out of rocks, and God will lead them through the sea. You've got to read this language, it's so gorgeous. He's engaging in typology. He's saying, yes, we've had a first Exodus, but what about a second Exodus, okay? He's not saying the first Exodus never happened or that it was just purely a prediction or existed only so that they could talk about it now. He's saying that history is maybe a little bit more mystical than we're used to thinking about it being. He's saying that history is never really over in a sense. You don't even have to predict it, okay? It's kind of like that the world of symbols, theologically and spiritually, which we see poetically, are imaginatively still being activated in the world, even we might say now in our time, today. That's the power of typology. And prediction, I think, in these cases loses its power in the first case I mentioned, because it just forces you kind of into this like anxious historical situation where you can't admit basic things that you're seeing, just from an historical or literary sense on the page, that this really seems to address a different context with different kinds of language and probably by different authors. That's fine. And in the second case, it would force you to think that somehow Isaiah chapter 7 doesn't say what it really does say, and that somehow people had no idea what he was talking about and were just waiting for this child to be born for 700 years, when that was absolutely not the case. That the text has a resolution within itself in this moment for Ahaz, and it is indeed a moment of judgment. And it's fascinating to think of the interpretive connection between this baby as judgment in Isaiah 7 and the baby as judgment in the New Testament as well. And that's something we lose from the Christmas story sometimes, is that interpretive connection precisely on the grounds of judgment. And maybe you see it in the book of Mark most clearly when Jesus comes out and immediately his first message is, repent. So I say repent of these naive prediction schemes, right? I think that Scripture is doing something much more valuable and much richer. All right. I told you, this always goes down like a rat sandwich. So I'm prepared for that.